He walked slowly around the room, as if time had stopped moving inside. The sound of the clock on the wall was the only thing that moved with precision in that home frozen by absence. The stove was cold. The kettle was silent. The rocking chair on the porch moved by itself, pushed by the biting wind that blew from northern Alaska, but inside the house, there was no response. John Wallace, 68, a veteran of the United States Navy, lived here, or at least pretended to still live. The house was simple, made of aged wood, full of memories that preferred silence to words. On the fireplace, a picture frame covered in dust hid the smile of a woman, his wife, who had died 5 winters ago. Since then, John began to live with loneliness, as if he were sharing trenches. Suspicious, tense, always on the edge of something he couldn't name. And perhaps he didn't want to. Sometimes he would sleep on the couch in the living room, with the TV on low, just to have a voice nearby. Other times, he couldn't even do that. The nightmares of war came back like sneaky enemies. The muffled sound of helicopters, the smell of scorched earth, the screams of those who never returned. Every night was a different battle, and every dawn another defeat. He avoided going out, avoided talking, avoided seeing himself. Not because he had anything to hide, but because everything that was left of the man he once was broken in places that even he couldn't fix. The only thing that seemed to work was the routine. Getting up, drinking a coffee that was too bitter, taking medicine for his back pain, another dose for his insomnia, and waiting for the day to end. Then, one cloudy morning, John woke up with a strange pain in his chest. It wasn't strong, nor weak, just real. For a second he thought it was the end, and, almost indifferently, he accepted it. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he looked out the window and murmured in a low voice, "If I disappeared today, who would notice?" No answer. Just the sound of the wind outside. No phone call. No note. No familiar voice. For a few minutes he stood there, motionless. But then, something, almost imperceptible, pulsed inside him. An impulse. A breath of will, fragile as a coal in the cold. He stood up, put on the thick coat from his time patrolling the Gulf, grabbed the keys to his old truck, and left the house without looking back. He didn't know exactly where he was going. He only knew that he had to drive. And so, without any plan, the truck's tires slid down the icy road until they stopped in front of a rusty fence with a sign written in faded letters. Fairbanks Municipal Shelter. Temporary home for abandoned animals. John stared at the entrance for a few seconds, frowning. It was a place he had never considered visiting, but something inside him, perhaps a forgotten memory of better times, pushed him out of the car. The air there seemed colder, or perhaps more alive. There was barking in the background, some scratching on the interior walls, and a heavy silence between the sounds. Have you ever walked into a place without knowing what you were looking for, but still felt like something there was for you? John walked through the gate slowly, his eyes alert, as if he were walking in unfamiliar territory. The smell of disinfectant mixed with that of wet straw. There were cages lined up on both sides of the hallway. Some dogs barked, others just watched, but none of them caught his attention. Until he stopped. And that's when everything started to change. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you deeply. He walked slowly down the shelter hallway, his eyes scanning every corner as if searching for an answer, and not just an animal. The damp walls were marked by time, and the sound of barking mixed with the clink of empty bowls. A puppy jumped and wagged its tail excitedly behind the bars. Another growled softly, trying to appear brave. But John passed them all as if passing through memories, with heavy breathing and a silent soul. When he stopped in front of that last cage, he didn't even know why. What he saw there didn't catch his attention. It was a medium-sized dog, thin with part of its back hairless, where the pink skin still showed irregular scars. But it wasn't the burns that kept him there. It was the look. A dejected look, like that of someone who no longer expects to be chosen. This one. He's already given up hope. the attendant said, noticing his hesitation. He survived a fire. His old family moved away. He stayed. No one came back, and he never trusted anyone again. Max, that was his name. But to John at that moment, he seemed like a mirror. Because only someone who has experienced abandonment up close can recognize that kind of silence in others. And Max didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't beg for attention. He just watched with a kind of calm that came from resignation. John crouched down slowly. His knee creaked with the weight of age, and the old scar on his leg throbbed, as it always did when the cold set in. He held out his hand, his fingers trembling. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to convince. He just offered his presence. Max remained still for long seconds, then moved his head slightly, as if he recognized the gesture, but didn't know what to do with it. There was no touching. There was no immediate closeness. But there was a connection. Brief, silent, and inexplicable. And maybe that was all they needed. When it came time to fill out the adoption paperwork, the clerk hesitated. He tends to hide, avoids contact, especially with men. It can be frustrating. I'll give him back. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the name firmly signed. John Wallace, ex-Marine, veteran. He's not coming back, he said. In the back of the truck, Max kept his nose pressed against the door. He didn't growl. He didn't cry. He just breathed heavily, as if every second outside the shelter was too scary. John watched the rearview mirror, calculating every turn, every decision. Why, after all, was he doing this? Why now? But it was too late to go back. The arrival home was tense. Max didn't want to get out of the car. When he finally got out, he sniffed every corner with his body curled up. He went inside and went straight under the kitchen table. And there he stayed. For hours. That night, John heated up some canned soup and left a plate of dog food near the rug. He sat in the chair and stared at the open door in the hallway. The dog didn't appear. There was no noise, no movement. Just the feeling that he had brought home not only a wounded animal, but everything he had been through trying to forget. Over the next few days, Max avoided anyone approaching him. If John raised his voice on the phone, he would tremble. If a pan fell to the floor, he would run for cover. The sound of the microwave was enough to put him on alert. And when the heater crackled with hot air, Max would curl up and turn his face away, as if still reeling from the trauma of the flames. John, on the other hand, felt rejected. No matter how hard he tried to maintain a routine, prepare schedules, offer affection, there was always an invisible barrier. And this brought up something he could no longer control. The memory of all the times he also felt unwanted. Of the empty looks at VA stations, of the merciless bureaucracy, of friends who disappeared, of the years trying to rebuild something that never had a name again. One night, while cleaning up the food scraps that Max ignored, he whispered almost without meaning to, "You don't even know me, but you're already afraid of me." And it was that same night that something different happened. When he went to bed, John forgot to close the bedroom door. For the first time, Max came out from under the table, crossed the hallway slowly, and lay down on the floor next to the bed, still a good distance away, but visible. The veteran said nothing. He just watched, and he slept with less heavy breathing. The next few weeks were like a careful dance. Max followed John out onto the porch, but kept his distance. He lay close, but turned his face away. John, on the other hand, found himself talking more. He talked about the weather, the coffee, memories of the base, and even though he didn't hear any answers, he didn't feel so alone anymore. But there was still a void, a gap of trust between them, like a bridge in half. Until one day, while cleaning out the pantry, John found an old box with burnt-edge photos. They were wartime records, men in formation, helicopters in the desert, and in the middle of them, a photo of his wife's funeral. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and stayed there, with the photos on his lap and his eyes lost. Max appeared, approached silently and stopped a few steps away. He looked, smelled the air, and sat down too. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. And this is where everything begins to change. Not magically, but for real. Like when two marked souls, without knowing how, recognize each other not by their appearance, but by their pain. If this story has made sense to you so far, write in the comments. I felt that too. And now, the deepest part of this journey is about to begin. The morning was colder than usual. The blue moonlight streamed through the window and touched the floor of the room like a cold reflection of everything inside. John was drenched in sweat, despite the cold, sitting on the edge of the bed with his bare feet on the wooden floor, panting as if he had just escaped an ambush. The nightmare had been intense, almost real. Sand in his eyes, gunshots in the dark, the radio crackling, and no one on the other end. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, as it always was, after reliving that same explosion that years ago had left half his team buried in the desert. It was then that he realized Max was there. Not in the corner of the house, not under the table, but close by, lying next to the door, as if he knew exactly what that silence meant. He didn't come any closer, but he didn't run away either. John stared for a moment. His chest still ached. His mind was spinning. And it was in a low voice, almost swallowed by the whistling of the wind outside, that he whispered, "I also had to escape the fire." It wasn't just any metaphor. He knew it. The fire that had scarred him didn't have flames, but it left ashes. Ashes in his marriage, in his health, in his soul. And there, sitting in the darkness of his own room, he understood that he wasn't the only one in that house with scars that no one could see. Max had his own, and maybe that was exactly what united them. Over the next few days, the morning ritual changed. Max began to wait at the bedroom door. Not excitedly, not barking, just present. When John left, he walked behind, restrained, silent, as if afraid of breaking the fragile trust that was forming. And that was exactly how John felt too, like someone who had just learned to hold something precious with both hands, but unsure if he could hold it for long. The first direct interactions came slowly. A piece of bacon dropped accidentally in the kitchen. A brief whistle as he went out into the yard. A name called in a low voice, Max. And the dog, instead of hiding, began to turn his face, recognize the voice, respond with a timid step in the right direction. But it wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when Max would regress and go back into hiding, moments when John felt ridiculous, sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, talking to a dog that wouldn't respond. And yet he kept going. Because for the first time in a long time, there was something there that depended on him, and that strangely made him feel needed. It was a slow process, like healing an old wound, like rebuilding a bridge over troubled waters. Sometimes John would look at Max and wonder, why me? And more often than not, the answer would come in a small gesture, a lingering glance, an unexpected move closer, a butt that swayed once before returning to stillness. One afternoon, while cleaning out the old basement, John found a toolbox with notes from the time he had done repairs for his neighbors. It was before the war, before everything fell apart. He picked up a screwdriver, turned it between his fingers, and felt the weight of what he had left behind. Max watched from the stairs. He didn't understand what was happening, but he didn't take his eyes off of it. John sighed. "You're also afraid of everything catching fire again, aren't you?" he said, without waiting for an answer. That night, Max slept close to the bed. Not in the corner. Close. And when John woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of distant thunder, he realized that the dog had placed his head on the rug next to him. Not touching, but almost there. It was a small gesture, but for someone carrying so much weight inside, it was like hearing the first note of a song he thought he had forgotten. But not everything was calm. One night, the oven beeped and let out a loud hiss. Max ran. He slipped. He hit the wall trying to escape. He stood trembling under the stairs, his eyes wide open, his body curled up as if the world was going to explode. John knelt down nearby and tried to call him. Nothing. All he could hear was the animal's heavy breathing, as if he were reliving hell itself. At that moment, something broke inside him too. John saw himself in Max. Not in the visible trauma, but in the response. The instinct to run, to hide, to think that no one would understand. He went back to the living room, sat on the floor and stayed there, motionless, waiting for Max to come out on his own. It took 47 minutes for the dog to slowly approach, rest his head on his knee, and breathe more deeply. It was at that moment that John realized this wasn't just about adopting an animal. It was about choosing every day not to give up, even when everything screams to do otherwise. Weeks passed. Max began to eat in his presence, following in his footsteps. Sitting on the porch next to the rocking chair, never on his lap, never on the couch, but beside him. With silent trust, like two soldiers who once shared trenches and now share the same roof. And it was on one of those calm afternoons, with the snow beginning to fall slowly and the sky tinged with grey, that John realized something that made him uneasy. He was less afraid of the nights. He didn't sleep better, nor did he dream less. But there was a different feeling, that if the world decided to end again, at least he wouldn't be alone anymore. Write in the comments. There are things that we feel, even without understanding. And, as unlikely as it may seem, the most decisive moment in this story was yet to come. The kitchen floor creaked with each step John took. Coffee dripped slowly into the rusty coffee pot, and the bitter smell filled the small room, as it did every morning. Max was already there, lying near the back door, watching silently. He didn't wag his tail, didn't beg for anything. He just watched, as if this moment, this simple, repeated ritual, was all he needed to keep from collapsing. John didn't talk much either. He pulled out his chair carefully, poured coffee, and stared out the window without really seeing. It was as if they were both frozen in time. Two different, but equally wounded souls, sharing the same shelter from the life outside. On this particular day, the wind seemed to be sharper. The wood on the porch creaked. The trees in the yard, covered in snow, swayed like lonely sentinels. John, holding the mug in both hands, felt the usual pain in his left shoulder. A physical reminder of what he had carried on his back in Kandahar. A pain that never went away, just like the others. The ones that don't show up on any test. He looked at Max. The puppy seemed restless. His ears were moving in different directions, and his gaze was more tense than usual. But John ignored it. He thought it was the wind, or maybe one of those sounds that only dogs hear. He had no idea that very morning, the tenuous peace they had built would be put to the test. The afternoon passed slowly. John noticed that the smoke detector in the kitchen was beeping and doing what many people would do. He took out the battery and fixed it the next day. Just for today, he thought. He was too tired. The cold was creeping in through the corners of the windows, and the pain in his back was back with a vengeance. He took 2 pills, then another. He knew it was risky, but his body wasn't cooperating as it used to. Max stayed close by as he prepared for bed. He sat in the hallway, attentive, his eyes fixed on the half-open bedroom door, as he did every night. Only this time, John didn't exchange any words. He didn't stroke the dog's head. He just lay down, sighed deeply, and closed his eyes as if surrendering himself. Not to sleep, but to the weight of the days. Just after midnight, as the cold froze the roof and branches thudded against the windows, a sharp crack cut through the silence. A loose wire behind the refrigerator sparked. The flame started small, slithering like a snake under the cabinet. Within seconds, a curtain caught fire. But the alarm was silent. No one saw it. No one heard it. Only Max. The dog jumped up, the hairs on his back standing on end. He sniffed the air, felt the different heat in the room. His eyes widened. His instincts came back in full force. The fear, the panic, the smell of smoke. Like the day he lost his first home. Like when the fire engulfed everything, and no one came back to get him. Max ran to the kitchen, stopped in front of the flames, and gave a dry bark. Just one. Then he went back to the bedroom. John didn't move. The medicine kept him still, too deep to hear anything. Max jumped on the bed. He barked once, then twice. He bit the sheet. He pulled hard. He pawed at the man's leg. But nothing. The fire was already spreading through the shelves, and smoke was beginning to fill the hallway. Max stood still for a second. He was shaking. His instincts told him to run, to get away, to get out of there. But something inside him said something else. Something that didn't come from fear, but from loyalty. From the silent bond that had been born on cold mornings, in exchanged glances, in shared pain. Max went back to bed. He bit down hard on the sleeve of John's shirt and pulled. The veteran's body moved. He groaned. He opened his eyes in fright, coughing. The smoke was already thick. His eyes burned. He staggered to the side of the bed, not understanding anything. "Max?" he stammered. But the dog was already at the door, barking, calling. John struggled to his feet. Each step felt heavy, as if he were in another war. But he followed Max to the back. Smoke was now filling the ceiling. The heat was growing. The hallway seemed smaller. He reached out and opened the door, and the cold, early morning air hit him like a slap in the face. He walked out with Max in front, stumbling over his own feet. Minutes later, flames were engulfing the kitchen ceiling. The entire structure was shaking. The heat could be felt on the other side of the fence. John fell to his knees in the snow. He coughed and coughed. Max stood beside him, panting, covered in soot. Neither of them said anything. They were just breathing, alive. Barely alive. When the firefighters arrived, the scene was different. Part of the house had collapsed. One of the men approached and asked, "Did you hear the alarm?" John shook his head. "The dog woke me up." The firefighter looked at Max and said quietly, "If he hadn't done that, it would have been too late." Later, still sitting on the edge of the rescue truck, wrapped in a thick blanket and with tears in his eyes, John looked down at Max, who was now huddled near his feet. And in that moment, with the destroyed house behind them and the Alaskan sky above them, he whispered, "You survived the fire and saved me from mine." And that wasn't just a phrase. It was the truth he had never been able to tell himself, that he was sinking, and he no longer knew how to ask for help. Write in the comments. I also know what it is to survive in silence. From here on, everything changes, because what seemed like the end was just paving the way for a new beginning. The sky was still dark when the first rays of light began to hit the wreckage of the house. Smoke hung thick over the rubble, leaving in the air that bitter-sweet smell of burning wood, mixed with everything that once had a name and was now just ash. Heat still escaped from the floor in invisible waves. The living room rug was gone, as was the kitchen table. John's favorite armchair, where he had spent so many nights awake in silence, was now just crooked and crooked coals. Max lay in the backseat of the fire truck, his eyes fixed on the open door. He wasn't crying. He wasn't barking. He was just breathing. He was covered in soot, his fur singed, and yet he stood up straight, watchful, as if he knew the mission wasn't over yet. John was nearby, sitting with the thick blanket over his shoulders, watching everything with a lost gaze between what was and what will never be again. His face still scarred by the smoke, his hands with small cuts and burns, and his entire body still groggy from the sedation that had almost kept him asleep. Forever. But he was there. Alive. And he knew he was only there because Max, the rejected dog, had called him back. One of the firemen, his helmet still stained with soot, approached. "You were lucky, Mr. Wallace. Very lucky." But John didn't answer. He stared at the ashes as if searching for traces of something greater. Not the objects, but the time. The time he had lost. The time he had ignored. The time that was now beginning to take its toll. Hours later, when the crew had finished salvaging the house, John walked through the remains of the house. Each step sank into the wet, dirty snow. He bent down with difficulty near a piece of what had been his dresser and pulled something out from under the charred wood. His wife's picture frame. The glass was shattered, the picture charred at the edges but still recognizable. She was smiling. She was still smiling. And there, kneeling in the snow, his eyes burning and his heart aching, he finally understood. That house might be gone, but what he had rediscovered inside it, the ability to trust, to feel, to protect and be protected, that no one could burn. In the days that followed, while the world outside continued with its haste and distraction, John and Max took refuge in the garage of an old Navy buddy. He had offered them shelter when he heard what had happened. "You saved a lot of people, John. Maybe now someone will just return the favor." But he knew that it wasn't just that. Max hadn't acted on instinct. Not just that. There was something deeper there. A connection born of mutual pain, of abandonment, of shared fear. Max understood the signs. He understood the silences. It was as if each of their traumas had found an answer in the other. And on that burning dawn, it was this invisible connection that became an alarm, a rescue, and a miracle. John spent days reflecting in silence. He didn't talk to many people. He didn't answer calls. He slept little. But there was something different in his gestures. A more attentive care for Max, a lightness that slowly tried to infiltrate his routine. One afternoon, while cleaning the backyard of the makeshift garage where they were staying, he saw Max lying in the sun. For the first time, the dog was sleeping soundly, without startling, without looking around, and that made him smile. A shy smile, almost imperceptible, but genuine. Later, he sat at the table with an old notebook. He opened it to the first page and wrote in shaky handwriting, "Max survived the fire and saved me from mine." He closed his eyes for a moment. The sound of burning wood still haunted his mind. But now, mixed in with it, was another memory. The tugging on his sleeve, the desperate barking, the rush through the smoke-filled house. The exact moment when it could have all ended, but didn't. And it was only then that he realized something bigger, something he had perhaps been trying to ignore. This house was no longer home. Long ago, this place had stopped harboring anything alive. It was Max who had brought him back, not just to the physical world, but to the idea that it was still possible to build something, that there was still room for a second chance, and that realization came like a punch, not of pain, but of emotional impact, because John had spent his life serving, protecting, fighting, but he never thought he would be saved, and certainly not by someone no one else wanted. Comment here. Even those who have lost everything can be saved again. And believe me, what came next? No one in that village would be able to forget. The sun had barely touched the horizon when the fire engine pulled away, leaving behind the smell of burning wood, smoke, and a pile of memories reduced to ashes. John's house was no longer a house. It was a smoldering skeleton surrounded by memories distorted by the heat. But in the charred chaos, sitting on the barely there steps, John stared at something else. Max. The dog stood beside him, his fur stained with soot, his chest rising and falling heavily. His gaze was not one of fear or pain. It was one of alertness, as if he were waiting for something. Maybe a sign, maybe a word. John watched him for a long time, saying nothing. Until his throat tightened, his eyes burned, and the weight of everything he had held in for years finally gave way. He cried. Not like someone who sobs discreetly. He cried like someone who empties a reservoir of pain hidden deep in his soul. He cried for his wife, for the war, for his loneliness, for the years he lived on autopilot. And he cried, mainly, because he was still there, breathing. For some reason, he still had time. Max, silent, slowly approached and nuzzled his leg. A simple gesture, but it said more than any words. It wasn't just loyalty. It was recognition. That rare kind of connection that grows between two survivors who don't have to explain anything to each other. The neighbors gradually appeared. A couple from the house next door offered blankets. A young man in a beanie brought coffee in a thermos. John accepted it silently. He responded with short nods, but his eyes remained fixed on Max. One of the firefighters, as he said goodbye, looked at the dog one more time and said, "This one. He's not just a hero, he's a miracle." Over the next few days, John was temporarily taken in by Tom Hargrove, an old Navy friend who now ran a small farm on the outskirts of town. The place was simple but warm, quiet, with the smell of burning wood and windows that framed the white Alaskan landscape. There, John and Max found a different kind of routine again. Tom didn't ask questions. He just left a steaming cup of coffee on the table every morning. Sometimes he would strike up a conversation. Other times, he would just sit with the newspaper on his lap, sharing the space with time and respect. John slowly began to breathe differently. Not better, just different. Without the weight of the old house. Without the specter of loneliness so present. He spent his mornings walking with Max along the snow-covered path behind the barn. He spent his afternoons in silence, watching the dog lie down on the rug in front of the fireplace. And at night, when the cold grew stronger, he would put a second blanket beside the bed, even though he knew that Max now preferred to sleep closer to the door, as he always did. But there was a subtle shift happening, a kind of strength coming back from within, as if every step in that snow, every morning she woke up with Max lying next to her, every cup of coffee she shared with Tom, rebuilt a piece of what had been destroyed. One day, while walking through town to settle some insurance matters, John was stopped by a woman on the sidewalk. "Are you the one who was saved by the dog?" He nodded shyly. She smiled. "I saw it on TV. How beautiful! How brave!" He thanked her awkwardly, but as he turned the corner, the impact of her words hit him hard. Courage. No one had used that word to describe John in years. Not after he'd been discharged. Not after he'd disappeared from their lives. But now he was hearing it because of Max. That same weekend, the municipal shelter posted a photo on social media. Max as a puppy, with a frightened look and his skin marked by burns. The caption read, "The rejected dog who saved those who gave him a chance." The post went viral. People started sending messages. Some said the story made them cry. Others said they had adopted dogs of their own who had been traumatized by it. And one woman from New York wrote, "If even he found a purpose, maybe I will too." John read it all, in silence. Max lay next to him, as always, but this time John spoke. "You didn't just save me. You're saving more people than you know." And the phrase echoed, because for the first time in a long time, he didn't see himself as just a veteran scarred by tragedy, but as someone who, even with his scars open, could still inspire, could still protect, could still build. Comment here. I also want to believe in new beginnings, and there is one more detail to this story. A detail that no one expected, but that changed everything again. Snow fell slowly that morning, painting the roof of the small cabin where John and Max now lived. It wasn't large, nor was it new, but it had been given to them by an old platoon buddy, who upon seeing the story in the local paper had decided to repay what one Marine would do for another. The simple wooden structure and the fireplace that creaked at night provided shelter, not just from the cold, but from the invisible weight that John had carried for so many years without naming it. Outside, the world seemed to not care what had happened. Cars passed by, the city hustle and bustle, and the neighbors, though more attentive to the dog's name, still treated John as a discreet figure. He preferred it that way. The unexpected fame that the rescue had brought him did not suit his quiet demeanor. The television report? He didn't watch it. He said he already knew the ending, and that the real credit went to Max. But what no one saw was what happened when the cabin door closed and the silence of the forest took over. John woke up every day before sunrise. He put wood in the fireplace, made coffee, and sat on the porch, wrapped in the same worn wool blanket. Max lay at his feet, his nose resting on his worn boots, and the two of them would stay there. Without rushing, without destination, just living. But even amid the calm gestures and the restorative routine, the wounds were still there. Some nights still came with nightmares. Some mornings still came with aches in his bones and memories in his chest. And every now and then, John would find himself staring into the fireplace with lost eyes, as if he was seeing something far away. Maybe a battlefield. Maybe his wife's expression on the last look in the hospital. Maybe himself, younger, trying to make sense of life. One of those cold mornings, Max didn't get up right away. He was lying near the door, breathing slowly. John noticed something strange. The dog's gaze, previously steady and attentive, seemed to slow down. His appetite had diminished. He approached, knelt down with effort, and touched his head. Max responded with a slight movement of his tail, but without energy. Worry went up like an internal alarm. John grabbed his coat, put Max in the truck, and drove in silence to the nearest veterinary office. The drive into town seemed longer that morning. The radio was muted. The engine vibrated like an anxious heart. He parked in front of the clinic, picked Max up in his arms. The dog didn't protest, and walked inside, as if carrying not just an animal, but a piece of himself. The vet examined him in silence. He ordered tests. He asked questions. He's had heat trauma, right? Internal scarring? Tender lungs? John just nodded. Could just be a virus, or a delayed stress response. Let's see. On the way back, Max slept the entire way. His head was resting on John's lap. And something about that moment hurt more than any old scar, because now, he was no longer just a puppy. Max was the link that kept him going. He was the presence that filled the spaces that not even time had been able to reach. And the simple idea of losing him was unbearable. But no one knew what he had in his pocket that day. It was a folded piece of paper. A letter. A short one. Written the night before, when the silence of the early morning seemed heavier than usual. It simply said, "If I ever forget what love is, remind me, because you taught me again." John had written it to Max. He had never meant to show it. It was a way to empty his chest, to turn his pain into words. But there, back on the porch, with the dog sleeping at his feet, he took it out of his pocket, opened it carefully, and placed it next to the dog's makeshift bed. As a reminder, as a confession. Over the next few days, Max started eating again, little by little. He slept more than he had before, but he still followed John with his eyes. He still reacted when he heard his voice. He still lay close to him. The recovery was slow, as it had been from the beginning, but this time, John wasn't worried. He knew that life wasn't about having everything under control, but about knowing what was worth holding on to, even in the midst of chaos. If you've made it this far, you may have felt something similar to what John felt when he looked into Max's eyes that silent morning. The certainty that a few connections can change everything. And if this story touched you in any way, even if it was silent, even if it was in a small way, then this channel is also for you. So, if you want to continue living stories that speak of courage, new beginnings and bonds that save the soul, subscribe here. With each new video, we walk together on paths that are not always easy, but always have meaning in the end. If this message was for you, write in the comments. There are stories that heal. I'll know you stayed until the end. And that, to me, says it all. And of course, if this video made sense, leave a like. It shows that you were here, that this story was worth your time, and that moving forward is worth it. There is a video here that complements this journey. Click and continue with me there. The next story may also change something in you.